Good evening and welcome to this special presentation. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. We're tracking all the updates from Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Italy. On day 2 of the G20 Summit, the special focus has been on the issue of climate change and sustainable development. In fact, just after the G20, Prime Minister would be participating in the COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow, United Kingdom. And earlier, United Nations had also warned, particularly the G20 countries, the prosperous collective of nations, that they themselves have not done enough to mitigate the challenge of climate change, and therefore today's summit on the commitments to emissions and to curb them are particularly important. Prime Minister attended those summits. In a short while from now, we'll know the details of what went on in those deliberations. We'll be getting you all the updates about Prime Minister's visit. There were some key bilaterals as well, but first let's look at the top stories at this hour. Prime Minister Narendra Modi attends second day sessions of G20 Summit in Rome. Climate change, environment, sustainable development dominates the agenda of the summit. Prime Minister Narendra Modi meets Spain Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez on the sidelines of G20 Summit in Rome. PMO tweets saying leaders hold talks on ways to deepen ties between India and Spain, both nations cooperating extensively in various areas. Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi says G20 countries have taken a number of steps to support sustainable global recovery for all. Also says in his closing remarks that countries have enabled voluntary reallocation in favor of vulnerable countries and supported COVID vaccination initiatives. G20 leaders toss a coin into the Trevi fountain. Tradition holds that a coin thrown into the fountain will ensure a return to Rome. And much awaited COP26 summit kicks off in Glasgow. Countries gather to deliberate on climate action and mitigation of global warming. 30,000 delegates and leaders from more than 100 countries participating in the climate summit. And Prime Minister Narendra Modi attended second day sessions of G20 Summit in Rome, Italy. Climate change, environment, sustainable development was high on agenda. Day 2 of the G20 Summit, this comes just ahead of COP26 Climate Summit in Glasgow. India's stance on climate change remains to support the need for critical enablers for galvanizing global climate action access. And Prime Minister Modi and other world leaders visited the Trevi fountain in Rome, and where Prime Minister also held important bilateral meets. We'll be getting updates of those visuals, but first let me tell you about the bilateral. In the bilateral, he said that G20 countries have taken a number of steps to support sustainable global recovery for all. The G20 countries have enabled voluntary reallocation in favor of vulnerable countries and also supported COVID vaccination initiatives for battling the pandemic. Let's hear in more.
Fight against climate change is the defining challenge of our times. Either we act now, face the costs of the transition, and succeed in moving our economy onto a more sustainable path, or we delay acting, pay a much higher price later, and risk failing. We must listen to the warnings coming from the global scientific community.
This was the Italian Prime Minister kicking off the day 2 of the G20. Meanwhile, Italian Prime Minister also said that countries need to focus on using clean energy and said that in order to act fast on climate change, countries need to focus on public-private partnerships.
The warnings coming from the global scientific community tackle the climate crisis this decade and honor the Paris Agreement and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. The shift to clean energy is key to achieving the necessary reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, and we can no longer postpone it. This transition requires a significant effort, and governments must be ready to support their citizens and businesses through it.
And then Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi, during the third and final working session on sustainable development at G20 Rome Summit, says that G20 countries have taken a number of steps to support sustainable global recovery for all. G20 countries have enabled voluntary reallocation in favor of vulnerable countries and also supported COVID vaccination initiatives for battling the pandemic.
The G20 has taken important steps to support sustainable global recovery for all. We have addressed immediate liquidity needs through the extension of the debt service suspension initiative. We have obtained the issuance of $650 billion in new special drawing rights from the IMF, and we've enabled for the first time voluntary reallocations in favor of vulnerable countries. We've also supported COVID-19 vaccination, therapeutics and diagnostics, including through Act A and COVAX, which are key enablers for the resumption of economic activity. Increasing our support is essential, but it's also essential to make the best possible use of the resources available, and in particular to optimize their impact on and their alignment with the achievement of the SDGs. Much important work has been done by the G20 this year on this key issue, and we need to continue to focus on this over the next few years, also by enhancing the collaboration between finance and development sectors.
And the Italian leader further said that food crisis is an area of concern in particular, which the G20 countries have pledged to address as a priority.
One of the most devastating consequences of the pandemic is the food crisis unfolding before our eyes. On current trends, the UN estimates that the SDG number 2, achieving zero hunger by 2030, will be missed by a margin of nearly 660 million people. The G20 must continue to show leadership in addressing this dramatic reality, building on the results of the UN Food System Summit, and keeping in mind the strong interconnections between agriculture, loss of biodiversity and fresh water, and climate change. The only way to truly build forward better is to work together and to leave no one behind.
And the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, also addressed the second session of the Climate Change and Environment. The Prince said the world as a whole needs to come together and do their bit to save the environment. In a rare invitation, Prince Charles, a committed environmental campaigner, has been asked to address the G20 leaders in Rome. It is rare for a member of the royal family to be invited to the G20, let alone be asked to address the gathering. His speech comes ahead of discussions between the countries about climate change commitments as a whole.
Following the recent COP15 biodiversity meeting in China, and with this week's COP26 climate change conference in the United Kingdom, it is only too clear that we will need trillions of dollars of investment every year to create the necessary new infrastructure and meet the vital 1.5 degrees climate target that will save our forests and farms, our oceans and our wildlife. Trying to form a global alliance amongst the private sector, as I have long believed it holds the ultimate key to the solutions we seek. That is why, Prime Minister, I am so grateful to you for recognizing this central truth and for bringing them in, giving them a seat at this most important table so that climate change can be tackled in partnership.
And Prime Minister Narendra Modi held a bilateral meeting with Prime Minister of Spain, Pedro Sanchez, on the sidelines of the G20 Summit in Rome. Prime Minister's office tweeted and said both leaders had fruitful talks on ways to deepen ties between India and Spain. The two nations are cooperating extensively in areas such as trade, energy, innovation, and more. And United States and European Union have agreed on Sunday to end a festering dispute over US steel and aluminium tariffs imposed by former President Donald Trump in 2018. Addressing the media during a joint statement with the European Commission, head Ursula von der Leyen on the sidelines of the G20 Summit in Rome, US President Joe Biden said that the deal immediately removed tariffs on the European Union steel and aluminium imposed by the previous administration and lowered the cost to US consumers.
The United States and the European Union have reached a major breakthrough that will address the existential threat of climate change while also protecting American jobs and American industry. Building on our close partnership on our shared values, the United States and the European Union have committed to negotiate a carbon-based arrangement on steel and aluminum trade.
And European Commission head Ursula von der Leyen said that the new global initiative will add a powerful tool in our quest for sustainability. It will be a major step forward in achieving climate neutrality.
This new global initiative will add a new powerful tool in our quest for sustainability. It will be a major step forward in achieving climate neutrality, and it will ensure a level playing field for our industries. And following this US decision, I am pleased to announce that the Commission will also propose to suspend the tariffs that we had introduced. It is a big step forward in fighting climate change. The arrangement is of course open to all like-minded partners.
Meanwhile, on the third day of his visit to Italy, Prime Minister Narendra Modi began his day by visiting the famous Trevi fountain in Rome. It is one of the most visited monuments in the country and is loved by tourists. The Trevi fountain has always attracted filmmakers who've popularized the Baroque art style monument as an epitome of a place of romance. Other world leaders also visited this very special fountain. And that the leaders also tossing a coin, as is a tradition in the fountain. Moving on to special guests are joining me to take forward the conversation on Prime Minister's visit to Italy. Dr. Bhaskar Balakrishnan, former senior diplomat, and Professor Gulshan Sachdeva from School of International Studies, JNU. Good evening and warm welcome. Gentlemen, Dr. Bhaskar Balakrishnan, if I can begin with you. From the pandemic to what was the priority today, the climate change, host of critical issues in this edition of G20, how do you map the significance of this edition?
Is coming after Italy. Indonesia will take over and India will take over after Indonesia. Right. So India will be joining the Trioca from the 1st of December. So we'll be playing a bigger role in the whole G20 process. So as you described and as you reported, the main focus of today's discussion was the climate change and the effort to reach some sort of an agreement on how to, particularly at COP26, the G20 leaders are the most influential in this respect, and any kind of approach to an agreement among them would be very significant for COP26. However, the difficulties are there. What did emerge was that they reaffirmed the commitment to the Paris Agreement and said that they will try their best to keep it achievable. There was a reference to achieving net zero carbon, but no definite target or goals were set. And then, of course, the issue of coal-powered power plants there was an approach towards agreeing that no new coal-fired power plants would be financed outside in other countries. But beyond that, nothing more on definite on ending coal power plants, because that was something which a lot of groups have been pressing for. So that did not happen. And of course, countries like India have pressed very strongly on the need for finance and technology to meet climate change commitments, with of course keeping in view the need to maintain the tempo of development in their economies. So that was really a kind of, I think, beyond the formal agreement. Even though a formal agreement was not reached, I do feel that the discussions among the G20 leaders were useful, at least in clarifying their positions and exploring what are the possibilities for coming closer. The absence of the physical presence of Russia and China, of course, was significant. They were there only online, and especially as this was the first physical G20 after a long time. So that is the whole background to this. I will not discuss about the earlier days' work, which was on the minimum tax, and of course the vaccine effort. All that was discussed on the day one. Day two was really on, focus was on climate change.
Right.
Thank you.
Professor Gulshan Sachdeva, just to understand the kind of track record that this grouping G20 has had, on the face of it, we understand that this is a grouping of leading economic powers of the world. But given the kind of challenges that the world is facing, both in the climate, on the climate front, and the pandemic that the world is trying to recover from, what kind of potential does this grouping offer to the world?
Happened in the last 2 days at Rome. I think there are three dimensions, I would say. One is, as you have rightly mentioned, what is really happening at the main event at G20 Summit meeting itself, and then all the other bilaterals which India had with with France, Spain, Indonesia, and particularly with Italy, where we had a special new partnership for green transition was signed, and with other informal meeting with other leaders. And the third, I think, the Indian Prime Minister's meeting with Pope Francis. I think there are three different ways, three dimensions of what has really happened in the last 2 days. And interestingly, in all these meetings, whether bilateral or even with the Prime Minister's meeting with Pope, and of course, largely today at day two, the issue of climate and environment, sustainable development was common theme in all these meetings. But the question what you have asked is about the significance of G20 and particularly India's role in it. And now G20, I mean, definitely it has, over the years now, this has become a premier forum for international economic cooperation, particularly during difficult time. It did play a very important role in during subprime crisis in 2008-9, and then later on during the Eurozone crisis, to reduce the consequences of those crises for the global economy. Now we have this 19 members plus the EU member states under this G20, and they do constitute more than 80% of the global economy and more than 75% of global trade. So obviously the combined economic weight and political weight of all these countries, and if they, I mean, of course this is not a formal organization in that sense, but if they coordinate their actions, particularly during difficult times, and this has becoming more and more important. At the same time, this is not really a forum where only industrialized countries are there. You also have emerging market, you also have developing countries. So there is much more legitimacy, there's much more widespread, and they cover the global, but still, of course, many developing countries are still not part of this. So in that sense, this also becomes a responsibility for a country like India to take their concerns also to the G20 agenda. So now, since this has played a very important role in the earlier crisis, so today again the global economy is facing a serious crisis, but a pandemic-related crisis. So you can see now in all these meetings they had discussions on global economy and global health, because the the economic consequences of this global health. So unless you really deal with global health issues, you can't really deal with the economic consequences of this. So here, within that, I would say that India's role has also become much more important, because the way Indian Prime Minister has also proposed. I mean, if you look at earlier, the declaration from finance and the health ministers, where in fact, the Indian Prime Minister said one health, one world kind of solution to this problem. They have also come out with one health, one world health kind of solution, where the vaccine, the COVID-19 vaccination have been kind of considered as a global good. And India Prime Minister has asserted today or yesterday that India next year would be producing close to 5 billion vaccines, which is already helping the world, and already the 1 billion kind of milestone which India has achieved itself within India. And of course, more than 100 countries India has already supported through the vaccine inventory program. So, and then there is also a related issue of resilient supply chains, because for the last many years, the China had become a center of global supply chains. So now countries are diversifying, so India could also emerge. And in that sense, pandemic has also given a kind of opportunity to showcase some of our strengths.
Absolutely, sir. In fact, we'll have an occasion to discuss each of these points. Some important inputs are coming in from Italy, if I can just inform our viewers about it. India has achieved key success at the G20, especially on the energy and climate front. Instead of only focusing on climate goals, India, along with other developing countries, they were able to introduce language on what actions need to be taken, including by developed countries, to achieve these goals. For the first time, G20 has identified sustainable and responsible consumption and production, along with provision of finance and technology, as critical enablers for achieving climate goals of keeping 1.5 degrees, the vision within reach. This is in line with Prime Minister's vision of promoting the mantra of sustainable lifestyles all over the world. Sustainable consumption and responsible production patterns is coming from SDG 12, Sustainable Development Goals 12, and is aimed at encouraging developed countries to reduce their luxurious, energy-intensive lifestyle. It's a big win for farmers in India as well. India had pushed and obtained commitment from G20 for improving of livelihoods for small and marginal farmers. And there, Professor Gulshan Sachdeva, if I can just bring that point to you, there have been constant concerns, especially in the area of climate change and climate action, that there is nothing that is penned down very clearly in terms of structure. These information bits that have just come in, that G20 has tried to give a certain structure to the manner in which financing, sharing of technology for sustainable development will happen. So this taking structure is an important step forward, would you say?
Well, I mean, these things are important, but anyway, many of these technical issues will be discussed in the COP26, because, G20 is a platform where you discuss basically issues concerning global economic governance. But anything which is affecting global governance, global economic governance, obviously also would be discussed, since the health has been affecting now global economy and global economic governance. So health issues have also been top of the agenda. And now, since everybody is expecting that from 2022-23 onward, there could be a robust economic recovery in the global economy. And in that recovery, now, many of the countries have been able to achieve intended kind of the targets which was set earlier, because there was relatively slow economic growth in many of the economies in the last few years, and particularly in the last 2 years, of course, it has been very badly affected because of the pandemic. But if there is a robust economic growth in the coming years, then of course the issue of climate change and achieving those targets will become even much more difficult. But this also provides a new opportunity, that this new kind of growth which is going to come, so the kind of green transition which is going to happen in the global economy, which is very much linked with the global economic recovery which is going to take place from 23-24 onwards. So that's why, in fact, every leader is now linking global economic recovery with those kind of green transition. And those issues are also very much linked, which today it was discussed, sustainable development goals, because the world already committed certain targets, I mean, for 2030, but now there was large disruption in the last 2 years. So already, as you know, Prime Minister Mario Draghi was mentioning that, you know, some of those targets also perhaps could be missed. But if there is a good recovery in the next few years, because still we are many years away from 2030, at least we'll be able to achieve those targets. And then within that context, you know, the very robust recovery within India perhaps would play a very important role, you know, because some of those key targets, whether these are poverty or about the climate change or health and education, etc., because if India is able to achieve, you know, high growth and equitable growth within India, I think the world would be able to achieve many of those sustainable development goals. This also we saw earlier between 2000 and 2015 when, you know, we have Millennium Development Goals, and there country like China and India played very important role in achieving some of those targets. So now the key areas of poverty removal as well as women empowerment and, you know, climate, etc., I think India also could play a very important role, both as a supplier of a reliable supplier of supply chains which countries are now diversifying, at the same time also equitable distribution within India. So India, I mean, countries are looking towards India, and India, of course, as I think Ambassador was mentioning. So now we are also going to take major responsibility from, from next month onward, where India would be part of, TLOCA. So we can also shape the agenda for the next, when India is going to hold a summit in 2023. And of course, some of these issues will continue. The climate change issue is not going to go away, and even as IMF has projected that most of the developed economies will come back to the pre-pandemic growth path by 23, but most of the developing countries will still will be many years away. So India also has to take up the cause of many developing countries, and food security, as mentioned by Mario Draghi, is also one issue that I think India should be really focusing in the next 1 or 2 years.
Right. Gentlemen, we'll take forward this conversation. Before that, let me go across to Rome in Italy, where my colleague Arun Sharma is joining us with some more updates. Arun, put in context the important inputs that have come in. G20 has identified sustainable and responsible consumption and production, along with provision of finance and technology. Those were key aspects, especially for developing countries, as critical enablers for achieving climate goals. What does it mean for India and other developing countries?
Well, it means that India will be in a position to implement the climate actions, in a better and determined and firm manner. India has always been at the forefront as far as implementing the climate action plans. Now, India is the only developing country that is committed to achieve its climate goals. So the big takeaway as of now, after this session of the climate is concerned, it is that we know this fact that this aim of keeping the global warming level at below or keeping at 1.5 degrees centigrade, this was delayed. This was supposed to be achieved, but because of the COVID pandemic time, this was delayed. But yes, now the developing countries, the developed countries in this G20 summit, they all have come together, and now they have said that this levels of 1.5 degrees centigrade, this will be maintained now. That means all these countries will ensure that they have to create an infrastructure in a manner that controls the global warming, that controls or the caps the global temperature below 1.5 level. Now we know this fact that there has always been debate between developed countries and developing countries as far as the carbon emission commitments are concerned, or the climate goal commitments are concerned. But here's the two aspects to it. If you look at this entire statement from the G20 communique, it says that financing will be an important tool that has been adopted, and of course the technological transfer, that is an important tool to achieve this capping of 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, ahead of this Glasgow COP26 summit, this big takeaway from multilateral platform like G20 ensure that the G20 economies, the world economy primarily, is committed to achieve the climate goals primarily, the environmental goals primarily.
Arun, Just to understand it a little simply, does that mean that this whole act of funding and technology being shared by developed countries with the developing countries will have a more clearer structure from the perspective of climate change? Because that has been a long-standing grievance, that there is a lot of talk about funding $100 billion a year and technology sharing that hasn't taken shape into any clear structure. So is this edition of G20 giving a clearer structure to that?
Absolutely, there is a clarity. Just to put and give an example over here, we know this fact that the green infrastructure and green technologies are costly in nature. If you buy a petrol or a diesel car in Indian market that costs you 5 lakh rupees, similarly an electric vehicle will cost you close to 12 lakh to 15 lakh rupees. Although government subsidizes or incentivizes for electric products or electric equipment, but yes, these electric equipment, green technology, green infrastructure is costly in nature. So there is a need to incentivize these kind of infrastructure so that they can be adopted at mass level going forward. For example, Germany is committing that it will be carbon neutral or climate neutral by 2035 to 2040. Other European countries, I mean, there are more than 10 European countries that are committing to be carbon neutral or climate neutral by 2050. So these economies, the developed economies, are coming forward to achieve the target of being carbon neutral by 2050. So if you have to achieve this global target primarily of controlling this climate change and limiting this global warming, there is a need to finance. And yes, this time around when G20 countries have come forward, there is a better structured way about how financing will be done to the developing countries by the developed countries. How will this pool money will be utilized for better infrastructure or to convert or upgrade the infrastructure in developing countries to the greener technologies and greener infrastructure. Second is technological aspect. Now, the European countries, the various developed countries are way more superior as far as this green technology is concerned. The kind of technology that plays an important role in controlling the climate change are available in these developed countries. So, but the point is that the big corporate house do not share their technologies to developing countries because, yes, there's a profit aspect involved in this because big corporate do earn a lot of money by sharing the technology. But yes, how can there be a sharing of technology with developing countries if the profit is kept aside?
All right.
Profit can be a secondary subject, but yes, the main subject should be that how can the planet Earth be saved? And in that aspect, how can technology be shared with developing countries so they can upgrade their infrastructure on the greener aspect, and of course, green infra can be created and upgraded via means of technology. So financing and technology are important aspects, but the big takeaway as far as the climate question is concerned is that the 1.5 degree centigrade stepping of this temperature is very much significant, just ahead of the Glasgow COP26 summit, which is scheduled from tomorrow.
Right. All right, Arun, thanks very much for getting us those updates from Rome. We'll be keep connecting with you to get the latest. Dr. Balakrishnan, if I can come to you. As the G20 summit is moving towards conclusion, the COP26 has already started. Some of the sessions have already started. Recognition of finance and technology sharing as critical enablers by the G20 nations. How important, sir, do you think that is? Because as I mentioned earlier, there has been an ongoing grievance that there is an understanding that the rich countries have to help the poorer nations, developing nations, but that hasn't translated into real action. The $100 billion per year hasn't happened, not even cumulatively. So this recognition, do you think that adds a certain impetus to climate change initiatives globally?
Well, it's a good thing that it has been flagged, but let me frame the whole challenge in perspective.
Please.
You see, right now, if all countries implement the pledges they have made, the global temperature rise will be 2.7 degrees Celsius. So even it will go over 2 degrees. So it's very clear that all countries have to do more than what they have already pledged. What the scientists are telling us, that if we want to reach, keep it below 2 degrees Celsius, then the entire world must reach carbon neutral by 2050. Now, this does not mean that every country must reach carbon neutral. So what India is saying is that the advanced countries should achieve carbon neutrality before 2050, if possible by 2030, 2040, and they should move beyond that to net carbon negative. Okay, they should continue to cut and go to carbon negative. And developing countries like India, which are still in the stage of development, we will try our best to reach net zero carbon, but it will maybe take more time than 2050. We cannot commit to any time frame. No, what is the technology aspect? Now, if we want to reach, limit the greenhouse gas emissions, there are two paths. One is to cut down carbon dioxide, go for processes which don't emit carbon dioxide. Another process is to actually remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, this technology is called carbon capture, use, and sequestration. So a lot of scientific work is going on, but I think the international community must fund a huge research program into carbon capture, use, and sequestration. That is very clear. If we can achieve a breakthrough in that technology, then we would have some relief from this whole prison of limited carbon dioxide. We will be able to reduce and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's a very important area of research which needs support. The other area of research which needs a lot of support is solar energy capture, storage, systems. That means using batteries, green hydrogen from fuel cells, so that the energy can be captured, stored, and used in the night. So a major scientific program in this field is also essential if we have to deal with climate change. Now, the point is there is nobody talking about the science and technology effort required for climate change. Everybody is talking in the air about this and that and political issues, finance. Unless you develop the technology, mankind as a whole will not do it. Now we are spending huge amount of money going to the moon, on CERN, on ITER. We are not even spending a small fraction of this on research on things like the two main pillars which I mentioned. So this is a very important area of work.
And sir, when you talk about technology,
the third scientific program which is absolutely essential is improving global climate models. Now that was a Nobel Prize was awarded finally for work in this, but far too little effort is going on this. We need to have accurate global climate models so that we know precisely what will happen to the global climate as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. We should be able to predict extreme climate events like cyclones, floods, so that people can prepare in advance and we can reduce the damage. So these are the three large-scale scientific programs which are absolutely important for climate change. But unfortunately, nobody's talking about this. I don't think even people understand this.
Right. Professor Sachdeva, if I again quote from the inputs that have come in from Italy, talking about bridging the gap between richer and poorer nations, whether we talk about the G20 or the COP26, we see this narrative of the wide gap between the rich countries and the poorer countries is a matter of concern. So when G20 talks about bridging that gap in terms of having sustainable lifestyles and shunning away luxurious lifestyles so that development, so that access to resources can happen in a different part of the world, how significant is that recognition? Do you think that is a step forward, that is a step up from how this narrative has been taking place earlier?
Well, I mean, these statements are useful. At least they have, I mean, there is certain recognition now that unless there is a sustainable lifestyle, we cannot really live the kind of lifestyle most of the Western countries, our citizens have been living. And to some extent, I think they are serious. But at the same time, there are also, other issues, which I think Ambassador, in the earlier speaker has also outlined very clearly. One is that, yes, there is issue of climate finance, there is issue of technology, but, many of those things also have to be developed locally by, many developing countries, because you cannot really, first thing is that, those technologies are not going to be shared very easily by developed countries. I mean, apart from, making statements is a different thing. Because even we have seen that even in the case of vaccines, I mean, India, South Africa, and, now China, all are talking that, at least you can have temporary suspension of intellectual property rights for the time being till the time pandemic is there. But still, most of the European countries and others have not really agreed to this. So there are issues of, the private corporates, and there are issues of inequality. But at least now, at the G20 level now, at least one can see that, many of these issues are being recognized. Now, how this is going to be put in practice, because, G20, of course, is a forum for kind of, just a discussion, at the same time also, coming out with certain framework, because, this is not really a kind of a forum of, there is a kind of commitments by every country in that sense. So, but at least here we have all countries together, industrialized countries as well as emerging markets and developing countries. So they have come out with a certain common, at least understanding. And those issues will be discussed over the years. And we do need, this is also true that many of the developed countries, they have developed technologies, particularly for green, transition. And most of the European countries and now US and even China now, they are, quite ahead in this area. But at the same time, this is also an area where they would also like to have major profits in the coming years, because if the whole world is actually, going towards green transition, if the whole, the urbanization, the processes, industrial processes, agriculture is going towards green transition, or all kind of renewables, then who is really producing all those technologies? They are going to, but they also, yes, this is a global issue which everybody is concerned, but at the same time, most Western countries are also, they also see a huge business opportunity in the coming years and decades in this area. So any country, so in that sense, this is again, when India is going to be chairing, in 2023, so this becomes again a responsibility of India to bring all these issues to the table. Because, when South Koreans, the first country from Asia, when they, held G20 Summit, so they brought development agenda, because with their own experience, development experience was very recent past. So similarly now when India is going to be chairing, and I think some of these issues, whether these are food security issues, and then issue of equity, and then the finance and how this can be equitably shared. But of course, there are also issues of inequality within countries itself, because it's not just only getting those technologies. But at the same time, at least now there is a realization that countries have to work together. Now, there are certain geopolitical worries, because within G20, you also have China, you also have United States, you also have Russia, and then you have, so there are also other worries, but this is also kind of providing platform, because we also saw in your report, the Europeans and Americans, they have now agreed to suspend all the tariffs. So it means the tariff war which was going on, they have agreed to this. Hopefully one can see, but though there are no easy answers as was earlier, but at least there is recognition, and at least some of, even it works in a different fashion. But we are talking about carbon pricing. Yes, in Europe, you have the emission trading system and, cap and trade system where after many, many years now, at least from this year, last 1 or 2 years, it has started functioning, the prices have gone up. But, the carbon pricing works very differently in different countries. In developing countries, country like India, even when we actually pay, high taxation on, say, diesel and petrol, etc., that itself is also kind of a carbon pricing of a very different...
And this sort of creating equality as far as carbon space is concerned was also the point that Prime Minister made while he was departing on this very important visit. And important vision statements are coming in from Rome. The newly elected president of COP26, Alok Sharma, called upon delegates to deliver on the promises made at COP in Paris in 2015, at which the governments had committed to keep the average global temperatures rises well below 2 degrees Celsius. He was speaking in Glasgow, United Kingdom.
The IPCC report in August was a wake-up call for all of us. It made clear that the lights are flashing red on the climate dashboard. That report, agreed by 195 governments, makes clear that human activity is unequivocally the cause of global warming.
So that was the newly elected president of COP26, Alok Sharma, talking about the significance of working together and achieving the climate targets that have been set by the nations together. Ambassador Balakrishnan, just to reflect on what Alok Sharma was talking about, United Nations time and again has been warning continuously about how the world is missing its deadlines. In fact, there was a UN emissions report that just came ahead of these two important summits, G20 and COP26. And the focus was also on the G20 nations, that even the prosperous nations grouping is missing the targets. The signs and sounds that we've heard from the G20 so far, do you see it augurs well for the upcoming COP26?
Well, the WMO's latest greenhouse gas bulletin did point out that carbon dioxide levels have reached 413 parts per million by volume, and that it's still increasing at the rate of 2 2 parts per million per volume per year. So it's not, the carbon dioxide emissions have not been controlled.
Right.
Now, you see, I think even this talk of...
the issue was also with the fossil fuels. The report had mentioned that the use is increasing.
Yeah, use is increasing. And now even to say that there should be net zero carbon emissions by 2050, I think is an underestimate. Why not all countries say we will try to reach net negative emissions as soon as possible? Net zero certainly by 2050, we will all try our best, but those who can should reach net negative carbon emissions. So that way, at least, we will be able to even undo the damage which has been done, particularly by the industrializing countries. I mean, those who have achieved industrialization over the last 200 years and who have emitted so much carbon dioxide, certainly they have the capacity to go to a negative net emission stage, and they should be pushed into that. Unfortunately, the outlook for COP26 is pessimistic. There is not any sign of a proper concrete plan of action. I think the best we can hope for is some sort of statement which will sort of paper over the differences and, of course, continue to express commitment to do something more climate change. Civil society is absolutely furious with the leadership of many countries that people like Greta Thunberg very rightly pointed out that, the political leaders have not lived up to what the people expect. So I think we will see some very hot days at COP26 ahead.
Right. Professor Sachdeva, just to take on that point about whether COP26 as a structure has the capacity to sort of regulate the very important vision statements that are being made at G20, and before that statements were also made in the Paris Summit, but UN has time again said that there's a lot of gap between statements and real action. What is then the way out? Because this summit, COP26, has already started. How could they do things differently to achieve action?
Well, I mean, the way out is just keep working together, because there is no other way out, because ultimately every country has its own interests, and, countries are not going to give up their economic and strategic interests so easily. But at least one positive thing which one have seen in the last 5-10 years now, that countries are now, one is that, earlier the kind of confrontation we have seen between developed countries and developing countries on each and every issue concerning climate change. Now that confrontation is there in a sense that, concerns are very different, and Ambassador has really very clearly pointed out many of those concerns. But at the same time, there is also a realization that unless countries work together, because certain countries do have finances, they do have technologies, but at the same time, even developing countries like India also cannot really say that we will not have the responsibility to tackle these issues. And I think that realization is there, and you can see that we also have now very ambitious programs of renewables and all other, and climate change is becoming a very important issue in all developing countries as well. But of course, they need to be supported with technology, with finance and everything else. And the second thing is because, ultimately technologies keep changing. So what is happening today, we do not know what kind of tech, because what are the price was there of, say, power from solar 10 years ago and what is today. Things have changed very drastically. Right. And 10 years time, things may change very drastically. And the second thing is, how global economy is really, growing, because the growth is relatively low. Then, at least, the things are postponed for a couple of more years. But if the growth is robust, as some people would expect, immediate post kind of pandemic recovery for the next few years, then the climate issue will become even more serious, because the more the growth you have, because even if some countries are trying to decouple growth from energy and other use, but still, I mean, large number of developing countries, like even in India itself, will continue to keep using coal and other, even if we have limited amount of, renewables and extra coming. So issues are very, very complicated and difficult. But at the same time, I think it seems that there is a will to some extent to work together. And I think G20 is one forum where at least the large number of countries which are responsible to, for greenhouse gas emissions. Because, even if they're 20, but, a large part of, greenhouse gas emissions happen from these 20 countries because they produce more than 80%, goods and services for the globe. So, there are those issues which I think they need to work together, and that's the only way out this can happen. But of course, there G20.
So I'll just put you on hold. Some important visuals have come in. Prime Minister Narendra Modi meeting German Chancellor Angela Merkel for a bilateral meet. This is the second important bilateral of the day for Prime Minister after having met the leader of Spain. Prime Minister Narendra Modi with his delegation, meeting the delegation from Germany, led by Chancellor Angela Merkel. And those updates coming in, we'll be getting you more updates about what went on in that bilateral meet. Prime Minister Narendra Modi was meeting German Chancellor Angela Merkel for a bilateral meeting on the sidelines of the G20. Ambassador Balakrishnan, quickly your words also on these two bilaterals that have taken place on the sidelines, with Spain and now with Germany, the significance of that.
Bilateral contacts, and I think all the leaders are doing their own bilateral contacts. There was a very interesting meeting between the European Union and the US, and on the Iran nuclear deal, how to restart it. So that is happening. There was another bilateral between the US and Turkey. So I think our Prime Minister has seizing the opportunity to engage with all these important leaders, and I think making full use of the opportunity. So that is a very it's part of all these summits, and I think even in the Leaders Summit in COP26, the first 2 days when the leaders will be there may be more bilaterals. So now coming to the point which you said, where do we go from here? You see, when you are dealing with climate change efforts, governments are not the main actors. The real people who can reduce greenhouse gas emissions are industries, cities and states and subnational entities. Now, even when the US pulled out of the Paris Agreement, big states like California and New York, they said, we will continue to respect the Paris Agreement. So I think one important key is that the main actors who are actually emitting, like industries, like service sector, the energy sector, the big cities, they can all do their best to reduce emissions and in fact even go for negative emissions. So I think that mobilization will be more effective, especially when the leaders of countries will say this has to be done, but these are the people who will actually do the job. So you have to get to them, and I think that is slowly starting to happen. I mentioned the three main scientific programs which are absolutely essential. Right. A breakthrough in any one of them can save the planet. Unfortunately, we have to do more in that direction.
Right. Ambassador Balakrishnan, you have really reiterated the concerns about if enough scientific research is happening. I wanted to talk about the idea of technology sharing as well, but just staying with that point of pure research. Given the kind of dynamics we've seen between developed and developing countries, and you've also mentioned how developed countries may not give these technologies just over the table for free, then how significant does India's emphasis on becoming self-reliant become? Because we've also seen in the recent years our installed renewable energy capacity has increased manyfold, the prices of solar energy has come down. How significant is for developing countries to recognize that point?
See, any of these three projects cannot be taken by any single country alone.
Sure.
It requires a group of countries working together, like we did for vaccines, we did in the case of CERN, like we are doing for 30-meter telescope. These are all projects which require, like the Manhattan Project, to do work in this scale, you require international collaboration. And once you have international collaboration, that will be automatically a sharing of the technological benefits and the know-how. So I don't see that as a major problem. The vaccine period has shown us that how quickly we can all achieve a breakthrough if we all work together. And I think that lesson has been well learned. So
that's an interesting parallel. In fact, Professor Sachdeva, a lot of times this observation comes up that look at the way we've dealt with the pandemic. I mean, it's not a perfect solution that we found, but there was a certain do or die situation. Countries came together with all the flaws. There was still a sense of controlling the situation and doing whatever one could. Why do you think a similar sense of urgency does not reflect in climate action when we talk about countries coming together?
No, I think to some extent this is already happening. I follow Europe very closely, and you can see that almost every political party in Europe, whether from left to right to center, all those political parties, they cannot win those elections unless they really bring this issue top of their election campaign. So this has become a very, a kind of issue.
You're talking about the issue of climate change, sir, here.
Climate change issues.
Yeah, right.
Similarly, I think in other countries also, it is becoming more serious than it was. At the same time, even when there is a serious geopolitical tensions between countries, on the issue of climate change, I think what the US leadership and also the European leadership has said that they are really willing to work with Russia and China, because even if there are worries about other issues. So to some extent, I think that kind of consensus is emerging, that this is one issue in which we all have to work together. But things are not, at the same time, this is a long-term, but this kind of consensus has started to emerge, I think, relatively recently. And now only the realization of seriousness is there, and then you also have to, it's a long-term kind of project. You also have to build your own capacity, and our Atmanirbhar Bharat or whatever, any policies, Make in India, etc., because they can go a long way in ultimately bringing local technologies to tackle these issues. And the earlier you mentioned about these bilateral meetings. And I think in all those bilateral meetings also you could see that, I've seen all those tweets coming from these bilateral meetings. And I think the climate change and environment, sustainable development was also common in all these meetings. And one important bilateral meeting India had with Italy, where in fact, we have signed or we have established, strategic partnership for green transition. And this is something new, because we had more than 35 strategic partnerships now with different countries. But from Europe, we have seen in the last 1 year or so, we have a green strategic partnership with Denmark, and then we have water partnership with Netherlands. So it's a kind of a new trend one has seen, that yes, this is also a strategic kind of area.
Right, so that's an important point. Some important live inputs are coming in from Rome. India's Sherpa Union Minister Piyush Goyal, in fact, is going to abreast us with what has gone on through the day, and we'll be bringing all the updates. We'll be going across live now to Rome in just a bit.
This very significant engagement of Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi and his participation at the recently concluded G20 Summit in Rome. This is his 8th summit and the first in-person summit after Osaka in 2019. The theme was People, Planet and Prosperity. And truly, within this overarching theme, this G20 has delivered a strong message of recovery from the pandemic, recovery in terms of the economy, and across different sectors like health, employment, education, tourism, and most significantly, climate action. Leaders adopted the Rome Declaration at the summit, and over 5 days of extensive negotiations, extending late into the night, so much so that last night there was not a wink of sleep, and it went on till morning 10:20 in the morning today, when the final declaration was agreed by all the stakeholders. This communique gives a very strong message under the health section, where we have agreed that COVID-19 immunization is a global public good, and the recognition of COVID-19 vaccines, which are deemed to be safe and efficacious by the WHO, will be mutually accepted, subject of course to national law and privacy law that countries may have. But more importantly, it has been agreed that everybody will help to optimize the processes and procedures of the WTO for vaccine approval and emergency use authorization, and will also be strengthened. The WHO will be strengthened so that they can do recognition of vaccines faster. We have also agreed to extend the debt suspension service initiative so that vulnerable countries, low-income countries, are not burdened with debt repayment at this critical time. On agriculture, we are very delighted to share with you that livelihoods for small and marginal farmers were at the focus of our discussions, and everybody has agreed that improving their livelihood is an important global effort that we all have to put in. Energy and climate was clearly the center stage of our discussions. India and many other developing countries pushed for safeguarding the interests of the developing world. We were also joined by the developed countries to increase the ambition from the current levels of commitment and active interest that the developed world has shown in terms of providing technology and affordable finance at low interest or grant-based finance, long-tenor finance. So we've really got into the text the language which confirms that the developed world has acknowledged that they have not done enough in terms of meeting their commitments, and that they will have to be more forthcoming in providing finance, in providing technologies, and the enablers to make the transition to a clean energy world in the future. We have also been able to encapsulate some of the actions that the developed countries need to take, and for the first time, the G20 has identified sustainable and responsible consumption and production, along with provision of finance and technology, as critical enablers for achieving the climate goals first decided at Paris, and as we have all agreed, we must aspire for even more ambition. Prime Minister Narendra Modi's mantra of sustainable lifestyles finds resonance in the Rome Declaration, and sustainable consumption and responsible production patterns coming out of the Sustainable Development Goal number 12, which is aimed at encouraging the developed countries to reduce their luxurious and energy-intensive lifestyle, has been discussed and accepted. We are very happy to share with you that we have been able to include once again and reiterate the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. We have also been able to push the commitment of the developed world to provide $100 billion every year through from now until 2025, and the commitment of all the countries to mobilize greater levels of capital for the less developed countries and the emerging economies. I am delighted to share with you that for the first time, we have also been able to put through that technologies today do not exist to be able to transition in a big way to clean energy, and innovation will play an important role in the years to come. The importance of energy security and the stability of energy markets has also been recognized at the G20 Leaders Summit. We are soon going to have another engagement on resilient supply chains, which will be attended by several countries. And for the first time, the mention of the CDRI in accelerating the agenda of sustainable urban planning has been brought into the declaration. We are delighted that what Prime Minister Narendra Modi had proposed in Brisbane in 2014 has finally been accepted by all the countries. First, the OECD discussed it. Now the G20 framework on base erosion and profit sharing has been brought out in this statement. It's truly a historic achievement for a more stable, and fair international tax system. Travel needs to get reinvigorated. We need to get back people's movement, bring tourism back, bring economic activity back, and we have all agreed to work towards a common framework for accepting each other's vaccine certificates. We have also discussed gender-based violence and increasing women's participation in the workforce. Also denounced the uneven distribution of unpaid care and domestic work. So in some sense, a lot of the agenda that India was pushing for, a lot of the agenda of the developing countries in which India took a leadership role, being representing them in the G20 for several years, has been brought into the text, along with data free flow for trust. Data for development has come into the Rome Declaration, and all the leaders of the G20 are now looking forward to the G20 presidency in India in 2023. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi will be embarking for Glasgow later in the evening today and attending the COP26 summit in the United Kingdom, again representing the voice of the developing world, the voice of the more vulnerable sections of society, and protecting the interests both of humanity, with very ambitious activity going on in India to contribute to climate change, to contribute in our own big way to support the effort to leave behind a better planet for the next generation. Thank you. Sure.
Hoe zie je nou in beeld?
Is it a compromise that was reached to not have a real date put in the
Madam, first of all, what we have discussed and decided is global net zero. So all the countries put together will be net zero, which means that developed countries, which have already enjoyed the fruits of low-cost energy for several years, will have to go in for net zero much faster, and possibly even go in for net negative, so that they can release policy space and some carbon space for the developing countries to pursue their development agenda. Second, in terms of the year, we still have to work on technological solutions. As I said earlier, there are no available adequate technologies for base load. There are no adequate technologies to be able to absorb large amounts of clean energy into the grids and maintain grid stability. And therefore, we will have to look at more technology and innovation playing an important role before we can identify a year.
So, the question is, how much India need in terms of funds for the climate transition that you are seeking from developed nations?
As I said, this is something that needs to be determined based on the type of technologies that would be available for that climate transition. For example, for our base load to be replaced from coal to maybe nuclear, we will need large amounts of capital for setting up nuclear plants, both to replace our current demand and for the future demand that our development imperative requires. Secondly, we will need to be a member of the nuclear suppliers group to ensure adequate availability of raw material for nuclear supply, and several other associated concerns around cost of power. So it's going to be a holistic solution which will emerge through more dialogue, discussion, and the collective effort of all the countries.
Maybe there is an approximate estimate number?
Not yet.
So India had pushed for commitment from the G20 on improving livelihoods of small and marginal farmers. Has there been some commitment from the world, especially in G20?
Well, a communique like this does not get into the details of each of the subjects in that much micro detail, but the commitment that they have recognized the importance of protecting livelihoods of small and marginal farmers is a very big achievement.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Sorry, it went on a little late over there.
While briefing the media about the developments at the G20, it came to a conclusion and he was sharing the highlights. Importantly, he mentioned how the voice of India, voice of developing countries, found significant space and attention at the G20. From the message of recovery to climate action, there was enough space given to the concerns of the developing countries. From the pandemic perspective, COVID-19 vaccine recognition, mutually acceptable recognition of vaccine was an important point forward so that trade, commerce and tourism could begin once again. There was a greater focus on livelihood of farmers in particular and livelihoods of people across the world, particularly from developing countries and poorer countries which have been adversely affected by the pandemic and also climate change. So there is a commitment to address the concerns that are born out of livelihood challenges. Also safeguarding the interest of the developing countries, and the point that Prime Minister in fact had categorically made of promoting sustainable lifestyle and consumption also found an echo in the larger vision of what came out in this edition of G20. There was a particular mention of reducing the excessive use of energy, an energy intensive lifestyle which is a lot characteristic of developed nations. That needs to be checked so that the developing countries, the poorer countries can make a space for themselves as far as energy ecosystem is concerned. There was also a mention of fair international taxation while the world opens up post-pandemic. Promoting tourism, again connecting it to the point of mutual recognition of vaccination certificates would be crucial in that sense. Also moving forward, there was a commitment in the area of climate action as well. Remember, as the G20 concludes, the focus now shifts to COP26 climate summit where all the leaders would be heading to now. That is taking place in the UK. In Glasgow, there has been a commitment made by the G20 regarding how the developed countries now have to move faster towards net zero commitment, not just reach the net zero earlier than the rest of the world, but also seek to achieve net negative carbon footprint as early as they can, so that the developing countries, the poorer countries, may have a little more space and time for climate mitigation efforts. Those were some of the big points that came out of Sherpa, India's Sherpa at the G20, Union Minister Piyush Goyal, as he gave a summary. Let me quickly introduce you to the new panel of guests who are also joining us to take the conversation forward. We have with us Manjeev Puri, former senior diplomat. We are also joined by Professor P.K. Joshi from Environmental Studies, JNU. Ambassador Puri, if I can come to you first, we heard broadly the points made by Sherpa Union Minister Piyush Goyal, and he said and he was happy about how developing countries, and in that a lot of leadership for India, found significant space in the G20 vision ahead. How do you look at the developments that have been reported so far?
I must say I can only go by what I heard the Honourable Minister say, because the joint statement is not yet out in the public, so we haven't really seen it, in a sense, if you don't mind my saying so. Commenting on the T20 without actually seeing the match.
Right.
But, you know, there's something to that. Look, I heard the Minister mention that they have been able to retain the very critical principle of common but differentiated responsibility. I think that's important. It's important not just symbolically, it's also important because it's a principle to guide action. I'm also very happy to hear that sustainable lifestyles, sustainable consumption and production at least is getting a mention.
Right.
So, you know, these are things which is important. We must remember the developed world would like us to look at climate change purely as a decarbonization issue. But it isn't. It is about sustainability. It's about better lifestyles, lifestyles that are more sustainable. And so I'm very happy that each of these things have gotten a certain mention out there. I'm of course happy that finance has been noted, that adaptation to the mention of the CDRI has also found a place. And these are important things. These are truly important from the perspective of all developing countries. And India as a major developing country which was present in the G20, we had a responsibility and we played our role. But I think we need to understand, if the reports are correct, if the issue of 1.5 degrees has got accepted, and I don't know if that is the case, if there is some kind of movement towards net zero, then we must remember that all of this does result in limiting the carbon space available for development. And there I think we must be clear that India is the largest geography in the world with a need for development. And given the facts of technologies as they exist today, and I'm happy that we are looking at newer technologies which will use either no carbon or less of carbon, that's great. But the fact of the matter, as things currently stand, the carbon budget would get hugely constrained if we move from, the Paris goal, which was 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees. And it does mean, therefore, the amount of carbon space that becomes available becomes less. But, these are things that you have to do in terms of your global citizenry, your responsibility towards the world, and then also taking it as a push towards getting or moving towards less carbon usage technology. Right. So, I think it is a bit of a mixed bag. The developed countries certainly have been pushing, and I would say we need to also acknowledge the fact that many of their key points have apparently got incorporated.
Right, you're right. We'll also have to wait for the declaration to come to see exactly how these concerns and vision has been put in words. We'll take forward the conversation, gentlemen. Before that, some important tweet messages have come from the Prime Minister, who's engaged in diverse conversations at the G20. First is Prime Minister saying, delighted to meet you, Mr. Chancellor. Today's talks, he's of course the leader of Spain. Today talks will add strength to the robust friendship between India and Spain. We had fruitful discussions on diverse subjects, including commerce, technology and environment. He was also there responding to Spanish Prime Minister's tweet message, where there's a photograph of the two leaders shaking hands against their flags. Important bilateral meetings have taken place today concerning Prime Minister Narendra Modi and other leaders. First up was the meeting with the leader of Spain, and the second bilateral that Prime Minister Modi had in Rome on the sidelines of the G20 Summit was with the leadership of Germany. Germany Chancellor Angela Merkel also held bilateral talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and there's the message from PMO India. Prime Minister Modi and Chancellor Merkel met on the sidelines of Rome G20 Summit. There were extensive deliberations on India-Germany relations. Strong friendship between the two nations augur well for the well-being of our planet. And those pictures also of the leaders shaking hands and the delegations in conversation. So two important bilaterals there, apart from, of course, the big summit, the G20, that concluded a short while ago. Prime Minister meeting leaders of Spain and Germany. Before I come to you, Professor Joshi, Ambassador Puri, quickly a word on the bilaterals that take place. Just not bilaterals without the focus on technology sharing, because the larger concerns that India and developing countries have gone to the G20 with, both the bilaterals speak about important partnership in the area of technology. Your thoughts on that, sir? Germany and Spain.
Well, let me first make the big point. These kind of summits, including the United Nations General Assembly meeting, are very important because they give you a platform to speak to the world in a sense. But in terms of real work, let us understand, it is in these bilaterals, and you have one place where all the leaders are there, and let's forget anything else. Simple protocol and politeness demands that they spend time with each other. And this is where the real work gets done. Therefore, the fact that the Honorable Prime Minister is meeting all these leaders is not just par for the course, but truly part of the meat of what you get delivered as such. So I'm very happy. Now, the two meetings that you referred to are with Germany, a global powerhouse, not just as an economy, but certainly in terms of a technology. I mean, let's understand, this Pfizer vaccine was actually developed in Germany. And, it is a German invention, if I may use this expression. And we can go on and on. Look at the German investments in India, whether they are in the electrical area, whether it's automobiles, leading manufacturers of them. Then you have Spain. let's also not underestimate that it is a huge global powerhouse. And if the developed countries were not limited to just 7, the G7, Spain would have been an automatic entry out there. Look at what we have just done. We've just bought military aircraft, military transport aircraft from Spain. The Spaniards are involved with us in the railway sector. So certainly technology is important. And I have a very simple underlying point to make. You know, for all the issues that Europe is facing, those are Europe's own issues. The fact that it remains a technological and economic behemoth are matters that we must leverage for our own relationship. And I'm therefore very glad that these meetings have happened and the focus has been on technology, which certainly for a country like India is the way forward and the panacea towards better development and better life for our people.
Right, and let me come to you, Professor Joshi, from the perspective of an environmentalist. How do you see the developments, briefly what we learned from Union Minister Piyush Goyal about the outcome of the G20? Also particularly important that we now go into another big and crucial summit, the COP26 Climate Summit. How do you see the outcomes from that context?
Good evening to all, and thanks for being me here.
Sir.
So, but what we see from our, local briefings, either from Ministry of Environment and Forest and even PMO before moving for G20 and COP26. So it was very clearly mentioned that, the emphasis will be on climate justice, equitable distribution of carbon space, and also asking wealthier nations to transfer technology and finance, which is actually needed to help many developing countries, including India, to deal with the fallout from the global warming. It is very, pleasing that the support for mitigation and adaptation has been talked very loudly. And more than that, the resilience building measures, which is something very prerequisite given the kind of disasters which country is facing, and most of them are said to be as climate change induced disasters. So that is another point which was talked there. Mobilization of finance, technology transfer, and importance of sustainable lifestyle. These are something which are needed when it comes to adaptation and mitigation. These are actually, the ways to go ahead for green and inclusive growth. And that is what country believes in. And probably, the country is taking the kind of leadership which was expected. And the very good point is, when you talk about association of small island countries, least developing countries, or also like-minded developing countries. So somewhere, given the kind of things which have been now being reported from G20, so many a times it appears very categorically that India is emerging as a leader in this front. And I'm very happy to see the Indian event to launch by the PMO of the country, wherein around 8 countries, to best of my knowledge, they have come together in a very new initiative to make critical infrastructure in small island states. And this is a commitment which was very much needed when it talks about, when we talk about resilience against the wide range of natural disasters, which are there already and which are also expected to be one of the, something main challenges which these countries will be facing. So these are the side shows of the COP26. I am hopeful that much better things will be coming up, wherein, the kind of commitments we already have, we need to translate them into action items. And there must be certain plans to, translate them. Maybe some newer announcements might come when PM will be talking over there.
Right. Professor Joshi, will of course be awaiting the G20 declaration that gives in greater details as to what the countries have agreed upon. But in bits and pieces, the things that we have learned and we're trying to understand from the perspective of developing countries, from the perspective of India, in particular, emphasis and use of the phrase promoting sustainable lifestyle, something that Prime Minister had also spoken about. Consumption, discouraging energy-intensive lifestyle, which is characteristic of the developed countries. What do these references mean for the developing countries? Because resources are limited. It's only when one part of the world limits their usage that the rest of the world can in fact get access to them. And I'm also trying to just push the idea to the concerns of food security as well. How do you see emphasis on sustainability augur for the developing countries?
Well, in the larger picture of climate change, mitigation and adaptation, these two have come as a most emerging, ways to combat that. And while doing this, there could be various pathways, carbon financing, phasing out fossil fuels, finance, these all kind of things are being talked about. But, the much better ways could be getting much closer to nature-based solutions or natural things. And therein, when we are talking about sustainable lifestyle or, green and inclusive growth, so that will bring out a very clear kind of balance. And probably even the developed countries, when we compare our energy demands or even the role in, pollution, so therein we see they have a much larger footprint, whether you talk in terms of carbon dioxide or ecological footprint. So I believe if these kind of, steps are taken care of, not only from the country as per se, but globally. So these will be bringing in much of the respite to food security, green cover, carbon sequestration potential, and biodiversity, which are equally important when we are talking about climate change. So that way, these sustainable solutions, and when the entire world is talking about sustainable development goals, so these are very clearly and categorically listed over there. So, addressing those will be certainly helping the entire globe to come up with a better way.
Right. Ambassador Puri, we understand that these crucial summits are taking place in the background of the pandemic, and one of the visions for these summits was to mark some sort of a collective recovery from the pandemic. An important part of that is the mutual recognition of a vaccine certificate. It sounds simple, but we've seen in recent weeks how complications develop from there. The G20 countries come to a conclusion that this is important and is to be done. How does it spell out for the rest of the world then?
Look, the G20 countries are the key players.
Yes.
If they come together and say that we'll have mutual recognition, I think to a large extent the world's problems are solved. Because, if you look at who are the major regulators in the world, one, you have the WHO. It's a kind of normative recognition. Once they say yes, but much higher level sort of checks are done by the US's FDA, etc., and the European Medical Association. So if these people come together at the political level, give the go-ahead, the experts would at least feel emboldened to try and, take things forward without at all in any way diminishing efficacy, safety, etc. On that, there should be absolutely no doubt. I think it's a very good idea. But, we haven't really seen this going forward, have we? The fact of the matter is that in the 2020 India-EU summit, it was agreed that vaccinations will be a global public good. But what have we really seen? Spats, all kinds of things happening. So I sincerely hope that the G20 coming together would really give a final and definitive push to try and see that vaccines become, A, the certificates become available, and B, vaccines are easily reached to people all over the world, especially in the developing world, who really are facing a tremendous shortage of this absolutely critical need of the moment.
And do you also see in that context that recognition for emergency use of vaccine should also be done more efficiently, given that you rightly mentioned the kind of lack of vaccines that we've recorded in poorer countries? It's about 3% of the population only in the poorer countries has access to vaccine, whereas over 70% of people in the richer countries are in fact maybe planning for a better second or booster dose. So that gap needs to be bridged, and these are the strategies how it can happen.
You are absolutely right. I say, look, India, of course, has a special and unique role. We are the largest producers, and, prior to the second wave hitting us quite bad, when we had little choice domestically and otherwise to turn the resources towards our own people. And this massive vaccination program that we've done, which has been hugely successful, reaching 1 billion people, it's no small effort. It's a massive thing and a success. We have again said we will take on exports. This will boost the global program. So I think, we are certainly doing not just our share, but much more than our share. But I do think, and I want to take people back to the old issue, the fact of IPR relaxation is still pending. Nobody is talking about it. The fact of giving more is really people are looking at India and pointing to the fact that you had the second wave, so you didn't start doing it. No, we are going back, and we are going back in a big way. But what did the others do? I mean, there are countries like Canada which withdrew from the COVAX program, and so many others who did that. So the fact of the matter is that, the world really must walk the talk, as they say, on the issue of providing vaccines, especially to the vast number of developing countries where, as you said, 3% have been vaccinated, while in the United States, you can walk into a drugstore and get yourself vaccinated.
Right, and sir,
So
there's this
these
one
are
point
things that must be done.
Yeah, there's one point, sir, I'd like you to elaborate on. You very correctly mentioned about the copyright issue with the copyright suspension issue with the vaccines. I mean, it is said, and experts have said that charity and donation of vaccine alone cannot solve the problem of vaccine availability to poorer countries. You have to give them resources to make the vaccines so that they can get access. So unless that address is issued, there can be conversations on richer countries trying to help, providing billions of vaccine, but not really solve the problem in the long distance.
I think you're absolutely right. Recently the South Center in Geneva carried out a study and examined two things: IPR waiver versus compulsory licensing.
Okay.
And they found that much better was an IPR waiver. Because as you said, you will allow whatever kinds of production facilities are available there to be able to utilize the formulations, etc., which are available, do local production and get things going. It would also help countries like India ramp up what they are doing, because otherwise the largest production that we are doing is a licensed production. And so, there are limitations to all of it. There is absolutely no doubt on it that there's been a lot of foot dragging, and the foot dragging continues to be. Now, all of us understand that the foot dragging is taking place simply because of the huge amounts of money. But, it's been 2 years. And isn't it time that everyone comes together and at least tries to put this pandemic in a sense behind them?
Right.
It's going to be around, but at least we should have the ability to be able to give one jab to everyone in the world. I think the G20 has done well to, at least take on the target of 40% of the world. Good idea. But push it, walk the talk. That's very important.
And that common wisdom that, just getting vaccinated yourself will not protect you. You have to make sure people around you, and I mean it in an international context. Professor Joshi, if I can come to you. It's interesting that we are simultaneously talking about the climate crisis and the pandemic. A pandemic that is immediate, climate crisis that is right here, impending, imminent catastrophe is what the UN talks about. How do you see the manner in which we are able to effectively deal with the pandemic? In this case, I'm specifically talking about equitable distribution of vaccine, playing an important role in the manner in which we can collectively engage to solve climate problems. How do you think these two are connected for the world?
Okay, when I see this pandemic, and specifically if I try to relate it with COP26, it has already got delayed by a year. So there are many such kind of challenges. Yeah, there are many of such kind of things which were there in the plate, but one was not able to address those because of this pandemic. So if we address this, the issue of vaccination, and we try to bring in a equitable distribution of vaccine and helping the developing countries, in a sense, we'll be able to address some of the key common challenges which are there across the globe. We need to bring people together, communicate, mobilize not only investments, but the thoughts, the people. So for the much more coordinated action, you just need, you are just not looking at self-vaccination, but vaccination of rest of the communities, rest of the countries. So these kind of things will basically facilitate many of the collaborations which are needed in research and development. They will enhance some of or promote some of the common platforms which are needed for bilateral, multilateral discourses, discussions to address the global issues. So therein, if one is able to address appropriately the challenges of pandemic, somewhere one will be able to accede towards addressing the issues of, say, climate change, biodiversity loss, or other kind of, ecological, environmental, global problems which entire world is thinking about. So somewhere this pandemic has actually delayed many of such kind of initiatives which were there in the
Do
pipeline.
you think in terms of resources as well, the kind of money that is needed to be pumped into development of vaccine or treatment of people across the world, especially poorer and developing countries which have faced the worst of the brunt? So the resources are limited. You put them into the pandemic, which is immediate, and probably think about the climate later. So that sort of makes the crisis worse in some ways, doesn't it?
Yeah, definitely it does into that. But being an environmentalist and looking at climate change or many of the environmental problems which are bringing this kind of diseases to us, so I would like to see both with the same degree of weightage. I would say by addressing one, you are able to equitably address the other. But for me, both are equally challenging. But definitely, as you said, the movement of resources, allocation of funds, these all kind of things are equally important to address the challenges of pandemic as well.
Right. Ambassador Puri, isn't it a little disheartening when, a lot of these interesting conversations and engagements about climate change and pandemic really boils down to the dynamics that exist between rich countries and developing countries and poorer countries, Very important commitments were made during the Paris Climate Conference. One of them was the funding, supporting the developing countries. $100 billion a year sounds excellent as a figure. But let aside a year, even cumulatively, we learn it has not happened. Now, the G20, we've heard of commitments like developed countries have to achieve net zero emissions earlier than the developing countries and rest of the world. And why just net zero? They should achieve net negative even faster. Now, again, these are commitments and the onus of which falls on the rich countries. I've committed, now I'll take my time to achieve it. Does the international order that we're all part of, is there a scope of doing things differently? Could Glasgow be different from Paris in a manner that walk the talk can really happen, and it is sort of regulated in a manner that we are a little less disappointed when we are 5 years down the line from Glasgow?
That's a great question. I wish I had a simple answer to it, because if I had the answers, the other people would have also had it, and the talk would have been walked.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, these are global power plays, and these are games that nations play. I think we must understand that. Climate change and the negotiations around them, if we separate these two things, domestic action is really for countries to do, but domestic action does have a lot of limitations in the sense that climate change is a global problem, and so you also need to take global action. Now, these negotiations are essentially about global burden sharing. And historically, the name of the game has been that the developed countries would like to shift as much of the burden away from their recognized responsibility as a result of historic and current emissions, which remain at extraordinarily high levels, to shift them instead to larger developing economies. And the G20 meeting was a precursor to what would happen in Paris. And in fact, most people said this is the place where the most important developed countries would be in a position to put a certain amount of pressure on the largest developing countries. And that's exactly what you will see unfolding at that particular point. Now, you mentioned this $100 billion. This was agreed to in Copenhagen in 2009, mind you. But, let's be very honest. There are countries in the developed world which take commitments and which, very standardly go back on. And the pressure is always sought to be put on the other side. But climate change is a global problem, and it's increasingly being recognized as one in which everybody has to do something. Now, India, I'll just make a little point.
Yes.
For all our huge developmental needs, and we are the only G20 country with a per capita income of $2,000. So, we are a country with huge development. Despite this, the kinds of suo motu actions that we've taken to address climate change, to address even greenhouse gas production through renewable energy, and of course on the adaptation side through resilience, through electrification, the railways being fully electrified, is absolutely exemplary. No doubt, we've been the only country on track among the G20 to meet the Paris goal. Now, the goalpost stands shifted. I understand that very well. But the pressure has to be such that the developed world must at least do its fair share. And secondly, let me make the point. At the very least, we must try and see that the remaining carbon space gets an equitable distribution so that at least there is a certain amount of growing space with even the current levels of technology for a country like India. You know, let me say something to you. If the climate decisions are that you will limit temperature to 1.5 degrees, the amount of carbon budget that becomes available to you, almost the entire amount of it is already taken up by the current emissions of China and the United States. So where is the place for others?
Right.
So we really have to work hard on all of this. And as you very rightly said, the developed world, and if you don't mind my saying so, I would include China also in that, need to go for much less than net zero well before 2050.
Right. Professor Joshi, your final thoughts really now. The manner in which the pressure and expectations would really skyrocket from Glasgow summit, COP26 summit, given that the thing that we're discussing continuously, all that was promised, committed to, those targets were not met in terms of technology, in terms of emissions, in terms of funding. How does that then make Glasgow summit even more crucial and a high pressure one, where commitments must be made in a more ambitious manner and also adhered to?
Well, you know, to me, after Kyoto, probably Paris Agreement was one which was giving a lot of hope.
Yes.
The entire world. But, you know, the way US President withdrew from there, that has brought the things to a very unfortunate end. And many of the demands which were appearing might be providing some solutions. They became very challenging for rest of the world. And the another way of looking at it is, you know, even if those kind of things are there, probably the groundwork which is much needed, because when it comes to mitigation and adaptation, it is a multi-scale problem, you know. So globally, one can discuss or negotiate on something, but the things need to be done at the ground level as well. So I see this COP26 probably need to rework on the rule book for the Paris Agreement, how those things could be realized very nicely. And more than that, there is some, you know, some loss of confidence. So probably COP26 should also look into the kickstart for the process of confidence building, specifically when it comes to developed countries vis-a-vis developing countries. That was trashed at some point of time after the Paris Agreement. Then if these things could be done, so the finance which was committed, probably the newer indicators, evidences are telling us that we need a newer plan, new way of looking at the climate finance. So, you know, a fresh thought need to be done, and also the entry points, how the developed countries can actually bring in, and those could be helpful to developing countries. And rightly, you know, everybody is talking about decarbonization plans, but where is the carbon space? And carbon space for the developing countries, countries like India. Forget about China being one of the developing countries which is having a huge share. So these all kind of things are there, but you know, simultaneously there is youth which is talking very loudly, and probably COP26 will be bringing that in much, you know, greater contours, wherein there is a hashtag moving around which says that tell the truth. You know, at least for the generation which is now as a main actor, and which is to play a very important role for the forthcoming one. Probably they are looking at how, you know, these negotiations and the big talks which are over there, they actually get converted into actions. So I believe if these could be achieved in this COP26, probably we'll come out with a very smiling faces, and probably something practical can be taken place. If it is a repetition of Paris Agreement, so I don't know, you know, if we are actually on the correct path. So there is actually needed to convert these talks into action items.
Right, let's hope we can smile over a longer period of time and see words turn into action. On that note, Professor Joshi, Ambassador Puri, thanks very much for joining us in the program, sharing all those interesting perspectives and insight into the context of climate action. Thanks very much for joining us. And in a bit, we'll also be going across live to Rome. Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi is addressing the media. Remember, G20 has just concluded. In a short while, we'll also learn about the G20 declaration, Rome, that will come. We'll see if we can just go across live first to Rome, where Italian Prime Minister is speaking at the moment. All right, we'll have to wait a little more for that. But while the G20 joint declaration of the nations come, let's again take a look at what India Sherpa Union Minister Piyush Goyal had to speak about as far as the outcome of the G20, especially from India's perspective, from the perspective of developing countries. It marked a conversation about recovery from the pandemic, mutual recognition of COVID vaccine certificates, improving livelihood of marginalized people, especially in agriculture and farming sector. That's an important point forward for developing countries. Safeguarding the interest of developing countries, their voice, their opinions and their rights to be safeguarded, both from the perspective of economy as well as climate initiative was being talked about. And also the commitment to climate change was made. And talking about climate change, the next big summit that the leaders immediately go into, which is in a day's time, is going to be the COP26 summit that has now in fact started in Glasgow, United Kingdom. Countries are gathering to deliberate on climate action and mitigation. So from G20, let's start talking about COP26, much awaited COP26 climate summit kicked off in Glasgow, United Kingdom. Countries have gathered to deliberate on climate action and mitigation of global warming. Some 30,000 delegates and leaders from more than 100 countries are participating in the climate summit.
Glasgow is hosting the much anticipated COP26 summit that kicked off on the 31st of October. This summit is witnessing more than 30,000 delegates and leaders from more than 100 countries gathered to deliberate on climate action and mitigation of global warming. Implementing the Paris Agreement and ensuring all nations achieve their net zero emission goals is critical. There are two major points that have been put forth by India, which is leading the least developing and the developing countries stand.
First is the finance, and second is the technology transfer also, because if you want that world will work on it on the same level playing field, so it is must required that they will provide climate finance as well as the technology transfer to the developing countries, and that is the main issue in discussion will be discussed in the negotiation also. India has already adopted a policy which is environment friendly and which will be give a contribution for the targets achieved by the world, given by the all over world in last time also.
Ensuring just, equitable and prompt climate finance tops India's agenda.
Without this climate finance, it is very difficult for developing countries to attain their development goal and the green development at the same time. So we feel that climate finance is the crux for the negotiation in this particular COP. If climate finance is made available in adequate quantity, it is assured, it is additional, and there is a fair distribution and collection formula for it, so that we are assured that whatever is being promised that will be available, we can plan our green development accordingly.
Both these points have been put forth by India along with like-minded countries who wants the developed countries to walk the talk in this particular climate summit.
First thing is that $100 billion promised was done in 2009. It is not fulfilled till today. Second thing is, you are very much right, it is not enough in the today's circumstances. If we compare between 2009 and 2021, the world is going ahead, so it is not sufficient. As for the India's stand is concerned, we are very much, so many times we say that we will be the part of solution. India is ready to solve all the issues.
Solution to climate change is not just setting net zero carbon emission targets as proposed by developed countries, but rather these countries need to acknowledge their historic responsibility for emissions and protect the interest of developing nations and those vulnerable to climate change.
Our stand is that if we want to achieve net zero by 2050, then globally it should be net zero. That means not every country need to be net zero by 2050. Developed countries who have used carbon space quite a lot compared to their own need and their eligibility. They need to vacate that carbon space and leave it to the developing countries, including India. So we will be net zero, of course, but later after 2050, not in 2050. When 2050, developed countries have to be negative and we will remain positive to be a global net zero.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi is pressing for a shift in the discourse on climate change. Climate action, climate justice and climate finance must go hand in hand. With camera person Praveen Johar, this is Tapush Bhattacharya for DD India, Glasgow.
And India, along with Australia, the UK and small island developing states, SIDS, will be launching a new initiative for infrastructure for resilient island states, IRIS. On the sidelines of the upcoming Conference of Parties or COP26, Australia, India and the UK have committed an initial funding of about $10 million. My colleague Tapush Bhattacharya spoke to Gayatri Sar Kumar, High Commissioner of India to the United Kingdom, regarding Prime Minister Modi's visit to Glasgow.
Joining me is Gayatri Sar Kumar, High Commissioner of India to UK. First and foremost, we'd like to ask you about the COP26 agenda. It's a huge event. Climate change is something that everybody is talking about, and COP26 is happening in Glasgow. What is going to be the major agenda here?
Well, of course, climate change and climate action with greater urgency. For India, it will be an occasion to launch two major initiatives under the International Solar Alliance and under the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. And of course, the fact that this meeting is happening straight after G20 in Rome makes it an occasion for the world to see how we can address the priority of economic revival alongside sustainable development through very, very good and urgent action on mitigating the impact of climate change.
Ma'am, Prime Minister is coming here. What kind of program can we expect in Glasgow? Indian community members are very keen to meet Prime Minister in person.
I think that is the only part where it will not be to the full expectation of the Indian community due to COVID restrictions, of course, and due to access restrictions, because this wonderful city is being prepared for so many delegations coming from around the world. Some of the members of the Indian community are coming to the hotel in the permissible number, and they will have the opportunity to see and to greet the Honorable Prime Minister. And of course, I'm looking forward to other occasions when we shall have the Prime Minister here on a full-fledged visit, and the entire Indian community, of course, will be watching now to hear the Honorable Prime Minister while he participates in COP26, and will be looking to the social media for his messages. So they will be participating in that way and welcoming the Honorable Prime Minister of India while he is here in the UK.
Ma'am, UK is having a bilateral with PM Modi. Boris Johnson will be meeting. What can we expect from that bilateral? I believe work that is going on along with UK and Australia about managing the ERIS program, if I'm not wrong. So what is the latest from that?
That, of course, will be a very special initiative that will be launched under the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure Initiative. That is India and UK and Australia. And it will be a way of helping small islands and also developing states to cope with, to prepare for, to preempt a disastrous impact of natural calamities, and to make sure that we have green infrastructure, and to make sure that we have climate resilient infrastructure. An amount of $10 billion has been committed, and we hope that there will be lots of partners in that very soon. The bilateral agenda is going to be a review of the implementation and of the roadmap 2030, on which a lot of progress has been made already since our two prime ministers met in May 2021. done, particularly in trade, in finance, in regional and global priorities such as vaccine, mutual recognition of certifications, of course climate action, and they will also discuss defense and security issues which are of common concern.
Appreciate your time. So that was the High Commissioner of India in UK. With Camperson Purnijal, this is Taposh Bhattacharya for TD India, Glasgow.
And representing the voice of youth, Disha Sarkar is all set for the much-awaited UN Climate Summit, or COP26, at Glasgow. Her main focus will be to advocate on climate change. Disha is acting as the lead action for climate empowerment negotiator. She has been engaged with United Nations Climate Change Secretariat and its youth constituency as an active and contributing member. Correspondent Taposh Bhattacharya brings you more.
The youth are making their presence felt in COP26, and I've got with me some of them, especially from India. I've got with me Disha Sarkar, and also from Argentina, I've got with me Liz. And these are some of these young people, the young generation, who are making their voices here at this COP26, because it is important that all the world leaders listen to their viewpoints, because COP26 deals with climate change and this impacts them a lot. Disha, what are you going to speak in COP26? You are going to represent the country.
Firstly, we the youth from the developing countries, especially India being a leader in the developing countries list, I believe that it's very important that we take climate action very seriously, and we give out this message that climate action now. We want robust actions in case of climate action, and plus I emphasize on climate education, climate training, public awareness, public participation, and international cooperation. And me being from the youth constituency of the UNFCCC, I believe that youth voices need to be heard. Nothing about us without us.
Climate education and at the same time international cooperation. I've got with me Liz from Argentina. Liz, it is important that every country comes together and make it happen. What is your take on it?
Hello, India. So we come from Argentina and we are here on behalf of the civil society, and it's really important that both developed and developing countries come together to achieve their nationally determined contributions that they need to have submitted in 2020. Also, developed countries need to transfer the $100 billion that they committed to transfer to developing countries to be able to reduce their emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change.
What about you? You came all the way also from Argentina. What are you looking forward to in this particular climate change summit?
In my case, hello. I'm from Argentina too, and for me it's very important to all the voices are together and fighting for the climate action, because all the reality are so different and all the people need to fight in this way and with necessities they have.
Appreciate. So these are the young voices, these are young people coming all the way around the globe in COP26. One voice, they are saying climate change is here, it is real, and everybody must come together in this fight. With camera person Praveen Johar, this is Taposh Bhattacharya for TD India, Glasgow.
The youth speaking very clearly, loud and clear about the issue of climate change. After all, both of these things, the youth and climate change concern our future. Now the G20 has concluded. In a bit, we'll also learn about the G20 declaration. As we come towards the conclusion of G20, the podium is also opening up for conversations on the COP26 Climate Summit. We'll be getting you all the updates as they occur. But for now, I'll conclude this presentation. Namaskar.